country comparison project, I've chosen to compare both Kenya and Cambodia, and here's some quick features about both. As you can see, Kenya is in East Africa, Cambodia is Southeast Asia, and here's some basic history and government. Here you can see the basic history and government, and now I'll do my analysis. Even though Kenya has a much larger population, it has about 3 times the land area, which is 581,000 kilometers squared compared to Cambodia's 181,000 kilometers squared. This means that Kenyan government will not see as much rapid development as Cambodia, since they must accommodate for a large population in the area, while Cambodia is smaller, so it doesn't have to spend as much, meaning it to develop faster. Likewise, since Cambodia has a small population, about 1/3 of Kenya, it's easier to form agreements and raise the quality of life. Cambodia was colonized in 1863 and 1953, and after 90 years, and Kenya was colonized by the British and the Crown for Africa in 1895, and Cambodia was colonized by the French. Kenya's colonial period lasted for much shorter, which was good and bad for development. This is because colonizers of both countries developed the countries alone. And examples the Mombasa United Railway that the British built in Kenya. However, Kenya had a much shorter colonial period, meaning that Cambodia could have been further developed by their colonizers, although their longer colonial period meant that they had more time to be exploited by the colonizers, which would have affected Cambodian development negatively. And recent wars and famines, Kenya is fighting the Al-Shabaab terrorist group and other terrorist groups, and Cambodia is fighting the fought in the Khmer Rouge rule, which is currently done. For development, the Khmer Rouge rule meant tragedy for Cambodia. This is because they lost 1/3 of the population, which meant that there was an excess of empty jobs. This meant that they couldn't keep up production of major exporting products, which probably led to spiking prices and less economic development. On the other hand, Kenya's problem isn't as severe in comparison, since the terrorists don't attack constantly, and they didn't gain political power like the Khmer Rouge did, even though the terror situation also deterred development. This is because they claim lives force people to move and force the country's resources to be shifted. Now I'll show you some industry statistics. So as you can see here is the imports, and you can see that Kenya imports a lot more than the exports, in which Kenya likewise imports a lot less. Kenya imports more, which means that they aren't making a profit, thus falling into debt because they are not generating wealth and therefore are forced to borrow money and further increase their long-term debt. As a result of this, Daily Nation concludes that their annual debt repayment is set to shillings 618 billion next year. Cambodia, however, is making more money off exports than they do on imports, which means that they aren't falling into debt and they're making profit, which can be used to improve the country, while Kenya's development will likely be slower since they're being forced to pay off their loans instead of redirecting that money into development projects which will benefit the country in a variety of ways, including healthcare, infrastructure, and education. So now I'll move on to headline development indicators. Here's the HAI ranking, GDP per capita, and GNI. Kenya and Cambodia are both very close in terms of HAI ranking, which means that their development is similar to each other, which according to the Human Development Index is median. Since Kenya has a much higher GDP, this indicates that they produce more, thus should be making more money. However, Cambodia is a much smaller country, so even though it doesn't produce as much as Kenya, it can still see more rapid development since it requires less resources to achieve development. Now I'll move on to the geography of both countries. So here you can see some minerals, arable land, close neighbors, and the climate hazard. An aspect of geography which helps both Cambodia and Kenya is that they are both within a good proximity to the equator. What this means is that they are within a tropical region, and this means that the temperature is relatively the same all year round. It's warm. This means that the farmers can farm some crops year round instead of laying off in winter. And in places that are not as close to the equator, it will be cold in winter, meaning that farmers will not be able to farm in winter, and this allowed Kenya to make 125 billion shillings off tea exports in 2016. This is very good for development because it boosts agriculture, which is a massive part of both the economies. Which, as you can see, the industry is very big in both countries. Specifically Cambodia, which rice farming contributes to about 5% of Cambodia's $16.1 billion exports. Now moving on to the fifth slide, I'll show you single development indicators. So here we have absolute poverty, which as you can see is higher in Kenya by almost double. And as you can see, Cambodia's poverty has been decreasing a lot, which has led to good development. Here's the Gini coefficient showing inequality. As you can see, Kenya is higher. Life expectancy in years, which in Cambodia is higher as well. And infant mortality per 1,000 births, which is higher in Kenya as they have less developed healthcare. And the health expenditure in Kenya, which as you can see is higher since they have a bigger country and higher population. School enrollment in primary school, as you can see, is a bit higher in Kenya. And as you can see here is adult literacy, which comes from 15 years and up. And you can see that it's a bit higher in Kenya, such as their school enrollment rate. And as an extra, I have divorce rates here, which as you can see, divorce is in Kenya are a lot higher. So, by far, Kenya's poverty rate is more than twice in Cambodia's, even though Cambodia has also a considerable amount of poverty. This is because Cambodia has been dropping a lot due to rice price increases, which is really good for development. For Kenya, about 4.5 out of 10 people live in absolute poverty, and 2.10 in Cambodia. This isn't good for development because a lot of people have bad quality life. Additionally, it's likely these people will stay poor for their entire lives and their children too. This is because it is hard to escape poverty, and these people don't have means to educate themselves. However, over the last few years, Cambodia has seen a massive decrease in poverty, dropping from 53% in 2011 to 21% now, as I previously mentioned, which is great for development because people are increasing their quality of life, and since they have more resources, they can make more skilled workers and earn more and ultimately increase development. Contrary-wise, Kenya will have less skilled workers since people live in poverty more. Moving on, I'll show you corruption in both countries. Corruption is not good for either of the countries, though it is higher in Kenya. The fact that corruption happens means that crimes can go up since people can get away with it, and this also deters development. Also, corruption allows government officials to get away with tax money that could be used for the development of countries. As a matter of fact, according to Duncan Miriam on Reuters.com, Kenya loses about one-third of its state budget annually to corruption, which is the equivalent of about $6 billion. This impacts the development extremely negatively as the country is losing about 30% of the money it could be using to develop itself. Overall, though, wherever there is corruption, it is highly likely that it will negatively affect development, which is the case in both Kenya and Cambodia. Now, moving on to my conclusion. So, I do agree with the rankings allocated to Kenya and Cambodia by the UNDP relative to each other, and this is because they are only 3 spots away from each other in the Human Development Index, which would mean that they have very similar economies. And I think this is true because they have individual strengths and weaknesses when compared to each other, such as GDP, GNI, national income, and a lot others. And even though Kenya is generally a weaker economy, it has a bigger population size, which leaves it almost on par with Cambodia, as it can produce more because it has a larger population, even though it doesn't produce as efficiently in Cambodia. Additionally, due to the same size advantage, this also gives them a lot of potential to develop and surpass Cambodia in terms of development. And when considering human development indicators that are also mostly similar, but when considering any of these, it is really important to recognize that Kenya is about 3 times the size of Cambodia and has a way bigger population. So what would be considered as a high GDP in Cambodia might not be considered in Kenya, since Kenya has a lot more to develop, and because of this, what for Cambodia would be a really high GDP, for Kenya might not be enough to get along all their people. Thank you for listening to my project, and in conclusion, I do agree with the rankings for Kenya and Cambodia.